Well, today is Threatened Species Day, but did you know that 3/4 of Australia's threatened species live on Indigenous managed land? Well, in fact, many Australian animals that were once widespread now have their last strongholds on these lands.
This places Indigenous peoples at the forefront of efforts to protect Australia's unique and vulnerable species. To tell us more, we're talking now with Bradley Mogridge, who's an Indigenous Liaison Officer at the Threatened Species Recovery Hub. Thank you so much for your time this morning, Bradley. Unfortunately and very sadly, more species are added to the endangered list every year. Has this past year been any different?
Oh, look, it's. I suppose it's on par, and there's got to be a strong case for threatened species to be put on the list, and I suppose into the future, Indigenous people are going to be a key part of the recovery of these threatened species. As we've just heard.
In what way can Indigenous people be involved in that?
Well, when you think about the Australian landscape now, nearly half of the Australian landscape is actually managed by Indigenous communities and people through land tenure agreements and ownership. So they are a real player, and having one of the oldest living cultures on the planet looking after these species, I think, is a good thing, and because they know these species, they know their country. And if they're part of the recovery and management and I suppose into the future that these species can thrive, that's the opportunities that we need to give them.
What are some of the main reasons these species are under threat? What do you put that down to mainly?
Oh, look, there's a myriad of threats, but some of the main ones are invasive species, whether it's plants or animals, predators, fire, weeds, land clearing, and loss of habitat is one of the big ones, of course.
Yeah, you talk about invasive species. What's the impact of, domestic animals and introduced plants and animals on our native species, especially those that are under threat?
Oh, look, some of the big key ones are no doubt cats and foxes, which are born predators, and they have a great impact on our small reptiles, but also mammals and birds. So these sort of predators we need to get them out of the landscape and protect our threatened species. We're starting to build these compounds almost that actually house threatened species, and that's into the future. That might be the way to maintain populations. But really, the threat is those invasive predators.
What is the impact, apart from obviously the sentimental loss of these native species, what's the impact of losing these species for the ecosystem?
Well, not only the ecosystem, but it's also the cultural aspect for Indigenous people. Is that a lot of these species are culturally significant, and there are cultural species that aren't threatened species. So they may be common everywhere else, but they might be rare on country. So loss of these species on their country can have vast effects, whether that's through the culture, but also the I suppose say the bandicoots and the bettongs and bilbies that are like soil engineers. They move a lot of soil and they have a role to play in that, and that losing those species from environments can have a vast impact on the ecology.
Talk to us about some of the unique Indigenous knowledge, traditions, culture and customs that we could draw on to help protect these threatened species.
Yep. Having a long history of partnership and knowledge of this country, Indigenous people have a lot to offer. They, a lot of these species, as I mentioned, are culturally significant, but some may not be culturally significant. Some might be just quite tasty. I suppose it's ensuring that these species are allowed to be on their country and thrive, and the knowledge that Aboriginal people have of these species is because they've been associated with them for thousands of generations. Australia has a distinct evolutionary path, I suppose, and we've been an isolated island for a long time. And as we move forward, the Indigenous people will be a key part in protecting these species.
Bradley Mogridge, we really appreciate your time this morning. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.